Fáilte Reproduction le páirteach sa díospóireach seo tá sé thar casta, tá sé deacair na téirmí a thuiscint agus níos mó ná sin na hábhar ó híomh tá gála bheith iad a fellsúnú in our era. I welcome the opportunity to take part in this debate, and it's actually quite difficult to get your head around all of the concepts, the medical concepts, what's possible, what's not possible, and in fact, you'd want to be a philosopher in addition to being a TD and a doctor and many other things besides. So I welcome that I have a good length of time in relation to this matter. I'm looking at a report that was done, the members of the commission that was set up by the current Taoiseach, presumably when he was Minister for Health back in March 2000. So 22 years ago, he set up a commission. They took 5 years to deliberate. And it's interesting what they said, and I come back to their 40 recommendations. They noted the social, the ethical, and the legal issues that arose in this whole area. The Commission said, the chairperson, it did not attempt to act as the arbiter of public morals. Its members were conscious of the strongly held and diverse feelings in the public at large. A broad interdisciplinary approach was taken that allowed recommendations to evolve as a result of informed public debate. It was evident that there existed a broad spectrum of cultural and ethical positions, and the report was intended to reflect the richness and variety of the debates that took place both in the Commission and the work groups that were commissioned. And the chairperson goes and says, if I may presume, and this was back in March 2005, she said, if I may presume to attribute an overall philosophical position to the Commission, I think it could be encapsulated in the form of a question. Should science do everything that science can do? There was widespread recognition of the benefits of advances in this specialised area of medicine, medical science, but this was tempered by a note of caution that society as a whole, and not just scientists, but society as a whole, must take responsibility for the management of major scientific change, especially in areas that are concerned with the dignity of human life. Now, I read that out, I'm coming back to fully supporting the bill in relation to assisted human reproduction. But there are many, many other aspects to this that need really broad discussion. And perhaps if I move from the quote I've given from 2005 to Schedule 2 of this bill, which sets out what is prohibited. And that in itself shows you where science is at the moment, what is possible, that we actually have to prohibit the creation of a human-animal hybrid embryo and many other things that are prohibited. So scientific knowledge has gone so far that many, many things are possible that are inconceivable to me, morally or it's injustice, but they're possible. So it's not just scientists that need to be participating or making decisions, it's the Dáil and its concerned groups. And having said that then, I'm very concerned that that broad discussion that took place between 2000 and 2005 was utterly ignored, really, until today. And they made 40 recommendations, and one of them was very, very far-reaching. I don't agree with it myself, and actually you didn't take it on board in relation to this bill, but that a presumption would be made in relation to the intending parents, that from the birth on, that the presumption would be that they're the parents. The child born through surrogacy should be presumed to be that of the commissioning parents, and from birth on. There was a dissenting view on that at the time. I happen to agree with the dissenting view, but just the complexity of what was involved here was fully discussed. Unfortunately, it was ignored. So fast forward then, 5 years ago, the heads of the bill was produced, discussed with 4 meetings only at committee with Dr. Harty, and they did a great job and looked at, but there was only 4 meetings in relation to such complex matters. And they produced a report. Some of the recommendations were taken on board and some weren't in relation to this. And then we have the report from the Special Rapporteur. And he points out in his report in 20 the state of play. At present, there is no surrogacy law in Ireland. The bill provides, no, sorry, that's just a summary from the, I forgot to thank the library research who produced 2 papers under pressure. And again, Chairperson, I don't know what influence we might have, but the library is under constant pressure to inform us and educate us. The bill was only produced last week or the week before. Coincidentally, in the same week that the rapporteur produced another report in relation to illegal adoptions and the importance of identity. So it's ironic, in both weeks, he said the rapporteur is emphasising the importance and the right to know your origins and your legal identity in a week where legislation is published highlighting the vacuum in relation to right to knowledge for children born through assisted human reproduction and the utter fragmentation in theory of that identity depending on how the assisted human reproduction is done. And I'm going to come back to that as well. As was pointed out by other speakers, in 2020, Professor Conor O'Mahony, Special Rapporteur for Child Protection, produced his report, a review of children's rights and best interests in the context of donor-assisted human reproduction and surrogacy in Irish law. He said, surrogacy is entirely unregulated in Irish law. This was 20 years after Micheál Martin at the time commissioned the report. So 20 years later, surrogacy is entirely unregulated. And then he goes on to say, the result is that children are born and raised in families. I had to read this a few times. The result is that children are born and raised in families in which one parent is treated as a legal stranger to the child. This fails to recognise adequately the children's right to family life and their right to identity in some cases of donor-assisted human reproduction and entirely ignores those rights in the case of surrogacy. This is contrary, and this is what I'm zoning in on, this is contrary to both the best interests of children and the principles of non-discrimination. And he points out that the Supreme Court has highlighted this issue. The impact, said the Supreme Court, the impact of this position, that is the lack of regulation on children born following surrogacy arrangements, has been repeatedly highlighted by the Supreme Court, which has called on the Oireachtas to fill this legislative vacuum. And so we're beginning to fill the legislative vacuum with this bill, and it is a good start. But it is important to give the context in relation to that. So up to now, successive governments have been pushed and pushed from the original commission, and then we had the 2015 Family Act, and that had some protection for children born through donated sperm or eggs. However, in relation to that, we have a kind of a crazy position where it didn't come into the relevant sections 3 and 4, never came into operation, I understand, till 2020, 5 years after the Act was passed. And when they did come into operation, there's nothing before me that Act is reviewed, or the operation of that Act. Now, separately, the cross-party committee said that this legislation was so important that when it becomes law, it should be reviewed after 1 year. And it was pointed out that that's not necessary by the government because standing orders allows for a review. Now, if that's the position, where is the review of the 2015 Act? Do we have it? It's not referred anywhere in what I've read. And I would have thought that's very important because when that Act, the 2 sections came into operation in 2020, there was an obligation to register and have that. And I have no access to information on that and anywhere. Plus, it distinguishes between children born through assisted human reproduction prior to becoming operational and post-operational. So we have a complete mess in terms of rights and identity. And that's just one tiny aspect of this area. So on top of that, then, we've completely ignored the international surrogacy, and I have my own opinion on international surrogacy, and let me place on the record that I think for profit assisted human reproduction should be publicly provided on a not-for-profit basis. It's absolutely essential and should have been done. I have no time for going down the direction of profit-led development in relation to this issue, which is particularly sensitive on so many levels. But of course that hasn't happened, but I understand the government are looking at that for some time in the future. But when you read around this, you can't escape the conclusion that all of this development outside of couples, regardless of their standing, needing help, which I fully and absolutely support. There are other aspects, and we can see from what's been prohibited, that's been pushed by a certain for-profit approach in relation to health, and I think that should be taken out of it completely in relation to assisting human production, should be gone. The existing legal vacuum is bad enough. We also have an information vacuum. We're utterly reliant on the clinics to tell us what procedures have been carried out, whether they've been successful. So we know from the library research paper that these fertility cycles have certainly increased and the trend is in an upward direction and so on. We can get those figures, but they're not from a central data place. So we're utterly reliant on those making a profit or for the information, and we don't know the outcomes. So as well as legislation lacunae, we have an information lacunae as well in relation to outcomes, how many successful pregnancies, how many live births and so on. All of that, none of it is there, despite the fact that we're on notice for a very long time. There was some regulation provided by the existing Health Products Regulatory Authority, which was designated as the competent authority and does have some oversight. However, it certainly has no role in relation to ethics or looking at research or looking at where we're going and in what direction. And if I look at all of the reports before me, the different things were asked of the government, and I think in a sense the government has tried to do its best with the legislation they have produced. But it needs much further discussion. The international component and what we're going to do about international surrogacy we have to look at it. Difficult and all as that is, we need a full discussion on it. At what stage will that happen? In relation to the welfare of the child, first of all, counselling again. I think various committees said don't make counselling mandatory. This is making counselling mandatory. As I understand it, it's also making legal advice mandatory. So it's increasing the costs on one, and then there's the whole issue of whether counselling should be mandatory. Again, I have an open mind on that. There was so much to take in here. I was doing my best to take it in and form an opinion that was based on an educated opinion as best I could. But I wonder what is the justification from your side in relation to making counselling mandatory, because my own background tells me that anything that's mandatory really is not a good way to start a process. It also increases the costs completely. There are many other ethical issues in relation to sex selection, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, and I agree with the restrictions that have been placed in relation to these areas, and it's only in very restricted circumstances. But again, the pre-legislative scrutiny of the heads is so long ago. The Commission is so long ago that not only are we talking about fragmented identity, we're talking about a fragmented discussion as well. And now we're waiting for the international element to be discussed by the committee. So overall, it's extremely difficult to deal with this subject in any coherent way. It's quite clear that Ireland is an outlier in relation to it, having no legislation. However, it's not entirely clear where all of the other countries stand when we look at the research on the other countries. Some allow for certain procedures, others don't, and so on. I believe that regulation is absolutely essential, and that regulation must be kept under constant review. I believe it's morally and on every level unacceptable that assisted human reproduction is available to rich people or those who have access to money, maybe those that are not so rich but can do it, but out of the question for people with a lower income. I believe that's immoral on every level, and it shouldn't be allowed to continue. And so it is absolutely urgent that we get a public model as quickly as we can. But we're doing everything like a jigsaw, and we're forming policy in a vacuum, really. That's what we're doing. We're forming policy in a vacuum without information before us. And with 22 years gone since we commissioned a commission. So I give my comments with that background. I welcome the legislation. I think it's important that we begin to legislate. I do find it ironic that the legislation, ironic, mightn't capture it, but I refer to this already, where we have a report from the rapporteur telling us on the absolute detriment, the damage to children and adults where their identity has been taken from them and where the state has stood by and allowed that to happen. And then, on the other hand, to allow an ad hoc approach to assisted human reproduction in a way that a child born through that does not have access to his identity or her identity or where they came from. Now, I know this bill seeks to rectify that and but I would like, again, that to be teased out. And then we have the situation prior to the 2015 Act becoming operational in 2020. So they're operating under another system, and the ones after that are operating under a different system. And all of the time, all I see is a fragmentation of the most basic human right that a child would know who their parents were, who their biological parents were, and their genetic background. So if we're saying that in one report from the Special Rapporteur, equally the same logic applies in relation to this. So while I embrace medical science and the changes being made and what it can provide to us, that must be done and regulated in a manner for the public good and the common good. And I also just, by way of tangent, say, I wonder if the same effort from science would go in to making our society more equal in terms of pollution, which leads, we've seen it set out, leads to infertility. Toxins leads to infertility, in addition to lots of other things in relation to health generally. Basic housing, this is separate from assisted human production, but talking about the application of science for the common good. I wonder if such effort was put in to other areas, what difference would it make to our society? The most basic thing like a house, how many thousands in this country don't have it, no security. And yet science can go down a road which absolutely is essential for assisted human reproduction, but it also makes possible lots of other things that are now prohibited, and rightly so, in this bill. And you'd wonder. So I go back to the basic question that they asked back in 2005 when they published their report. Should science do everything that science can? And should it be left to scientists? And I believe it should not. And if not, where is the forum then for looking at all of these complex issues that we must deal with as a society?